You made a mistake. Now what? What God told me. Hey, how are you doing? In today's video, I want to talk to you about what happens when you make a mistake and everything falls apart. When the shame hits so hard you can't breathe. When you can't look at yourself in the mirror. When you're wondering if God even sees you anymore, or if you're just invisible now. Listen, I'm sitting here in my living room right now. It's quiet. My wife Susan is upstairs. The house is still. And I'm thinking about all the calls I've taken over 30 years. All the people who came into my office on a Wednesday afternoon. Rain pouring outside. And they sat down across from me and said the exact same. If you enjoy true stories that seem like fiction, subscribe to the channel. There's much more to come. Here's what I'm gonna tell you in the next few minutes. You're about to discover why that mistake doesn't define you, why God isn't done with you, and what He told me that completely shifted how I see failure, how I see grace, and how I see you. But here's the thing. When shame takes over, when it becomes your identity, when it moves into your bones and makes a home there, that's when the real damage happens. That's when you stop fighting. But to understand how this all started, I need to take you back to something that happened in my own life. And it's not easy for me to talk about this. It's still not easy. And on that day, everything seemed perfectly normal. I was 32 years old. The sun was coming through the windows of my office. There was coffee on my desk, still warm. I had my practice going. 3 kids at home, with 4 more on the way. Susan was pregnant again. She was beautiful, exhausted, but beautiful. And I loved her the way a man loves a woman who's given him everything. I was riding high. I was the guy who had it all figured out. I'd go to church and people would ask me for advice. I'd be at a dinner party and someone would pull me aside and say, "John, I'm struggling with something. Can I talk to you?" And I'd tell them what to do. I'd quote scripture. I'd use all my training. I'd be strong for them. I'd be the rock. And I felt good about it. I felt clean. Every morning I'd wake up, kiss my wife, go to the office, sit across from people who were broken, and I'd help them put their lives back together. I'd teach them about integrity, about keeping your word, about honoring God with your choices. And they'd listen. They'd believe me. They'd trust me. Because I was the authority. I was the one with the answers. I was the one who had his life in order. But I was building my life on a foundation I didn't even know was cracking. See, what nobody tells you about success is how empty it can feel when you're the only one who knows the truth. When you go home at night and you're not the man people think you are during the day. When you're using the same words with your wife that you use with your patients, but you're not actually present. You're performing. You're giving her the version of John that she expects, not the version of John that's actually there. Not the version of John that's lonely. Not the version of John that's scared. Not the version of John that feels like he's never quite enough. And then it happened. One moment. One afternoon. One decision that changed everything. I was working late. My office was empty except for me. The sun was setting outside. I remember the orange light coming through the windows. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. No sounds, no footsteps. Just me and the silence. And a former patient reached out to me. She was in crisis, real crisis. She needed help. And instead of doing what I should have done, instead of referring her to someone else, setting a boundary, being professional, I went too far. I blurred a line that should have never been blurred. It wasn't an affair, but it was a betrayal. It was a moment where I chose something other than my integrity. It was a moment where I became someone I didn't want to be. And the moment it happened, everything froze. Time stopped. I felt my chest tighten. I could feel myself standing outside my body, watching myself do the thing I would never do. The thing I'd built my entire identity on never doing. The panic was immediate, physical, like someone had turned off the oxygen in the room. My hands were shaking. I couldn't think straight. Everything I'd told myself about who I was, all of it just collapsed. All of it was a lie. I drove home that night in complete silence. No radio, no podcast, just the sound of the car engine and my own thoughts screaming at me. I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes. 40 minutes. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the front door of my house. And I thought about leaving. I actually thought about just driving away and not coming back. I thought about how easy it would be to just disappear, to not have to face and that confession, man, that was worse than the moment it happened. Because the shame went from being something I was carrying alone to becoming something real. Something other people had to carry too. I told her everything, and I watched her face change. I watched the woman I loved most in this world realize that the man she'd married wasn't who she thought he was. Susan didn't scream. She didn't throw me out. She sat on that couch and she looked at me with this expression that I'd never seen before. Like I was a stranger. Like the person she'd married had disappeared and been replaced by someone she didn't know. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. The betrayal itself was bad. But the isolation that came after, the silence, the distance, the way my own children started treating me differently once they understood something was wrong, that was the real punishment. The next morning, the sun came up just like it always did. The birds were singing. Everything was exactly the same on the outside, but everything was different. Susan wouldn't talk to me. She'd leave the room when I walked in. She'd sleep in another room. I'd try to kiss her, and she'd turn away. And that silence was louder than any words she could have said. I stopped going to the office. I called my supervisor and told her I needed a leave of absence. I couldn't sit across from people anymore. I couldn't look them in the eye. I couldn't quote scripture. I couldn't be the authority. I'd lost the right. I was nothing. I was less than nothing. Because I knew that deep down, underneath the education, underneath the credentials, underneath 30 years of helping people, there was still a man capable of making the worst kind of mistake. For months, I existed in a space between hope and giving up. I'd wake up in the morning, and for a few seconds I'd forget about it. And then it would hit me again, like a fist in the stomach. The weight, the shame, the absolute certainty that I was done, that I'd never come back from this, that God was done with me too. I'd go to church and sit in the back. I wouldn't take communion. I'd stand during the hymns, but I wouldn't sing. I couldn't sing. How could I sing? How could I worship? I was a fraud, a liar, a man who destroyed everything he'd built. If you've ever felt that kind of darkness, that voice telling you that you've gone too far, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Now, I want to be really honest with you here. I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, that's not my situation. My situation is different. And you're right. Your situation is different. Maybe you didn't betray someone you love. Maybe you made a financial mistake that cost you everything. Maybe you made a choice at work that hurt your career. Maybe you said something cruel to someone and it destroyed a relationship that mattered. Maybe you broke a promise to yourself that you've been breaking for years. Maybe you did something you swore you'd never do. But here's what I know after 30 years of listening to people's secrets. After 30 years of sitting across from people in my office, the details change. The shame is always the same. The silence is always the same. The certainty that you're done is always the same. The voice that says you've gone too far and there's no coming back, that voice is always the same. Now, here's where I need to tell you about someone who understands this better than anyone in history. Someone who made a mistake that seemed absolutely unforgivable. Someone who carried shame that should have destroyed him completely. And that person is Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends. He was there from the beginning. He heard the teachings directly. He saw the miracles with his own eyes. He walked with Jesus. He was loyal. He was confident. He was bold. He was the rock. Literally, that's what Jesus called him. He said, "Peter, on this rock, I will build my church." Peter was supposed to be unshakable. Peter was supposed to be the foundation. And then Jesus was arrested. One night, everything changed in one night. Peter was in the courtyard when they took Jesus away. There were soldiers everywhere, Roman soldiers with swords. There was danger in the air, real danger. You could feel it. And 3 times people asked Peter if he knew Jesus. 3 times. And 3 times, Peter said no. He denied it. He said, "I don't even know who you're talking about." He said it like Jesus was a stranger, like Jesus meant nothing to him. Now, I want you to understand something. This wasn't a casual lie. This was Peter betraying the man he loved most in the entire world. The man who had changed his entire life. The man who had called him his rock. The man who was being dragged away to die. The man who was going to be tortured. The man who was going to suffer. And Peter stood there in that courtyard and said, "I don't know him." 3 times. And then Jesus turned and looked at Peter. The scripture says, Jesus turned and looked at him. He didn't say anything. He didn't yell. He didn't curse Peter. He just looked. And Peter realized what he'd done. He realized he'd failed at the most important moment. He realized he'd abandoned the man he'd promised to follow forever. He realized he wasn't the man he thought he was. He wasn't the rock. He was just a man, a scared, cowardly man. And he broke. He went outside and he wept. The scripture says he wept bitterly. Do you understand what that does to a person? Do you understand what that feels like? That's not just a mistake. That's not just a failure. That's the shattering of your entire self-image. That's the moment you realize the narrative you've been telling yourself about who you are is a complete lie. That's the moment you understand that you're capable of anything, even betrayal, even cowardice, even the worst kind of failure. Peter spent 3 days in complete darkness. Well, not literally in the darkness, but spiritually, emotionally, he was dead. He was sitting with the other disciples in a locked room, and they were terrified. And Peter was sitting there, knowing that he'd abandoned Jesus at the worst possible moment. When Jesus needed him most, when Jesus was suffering, when Jesus was being executed, the isolation was complete. His identity was shattered. His faith was shattered. His sense of self was gone. And he had no idea if Jesus would even want to see him again. He had no idea if he was still part of the group. He had no idea if he was still called Peter the Rock, or if he was just a failure now. A coward, the guy who ran when it mattered most. That's the space I was in here, like a brother who understands what it means to fall. I'd still be clean, and therefore useless to the people who are broken. Your failure is your greatest qualification. Third, you have to move toward restoration, not away from it. And this is hard because everything in you is going to tell you to run, to hide, to change your name and move to another state, to pretend it never happened, to start over somewhere where nobody knows. But restoration means you stay. You face it. You do the work. You rebuild trust, even when it's painful, even when it takes years. For Susan and me, it took 2 years in counseling. 2 years of me facing who I was and who I wanted to become. 2 years of waking up every morning and choosing to be different. 2 years of Susan learning to trust me again, piece by piece. 2 years of me proving through my actions that I was serious about change. But here's what happened. We're stronger now than we ever were. Not because the betrayal didn't matter, but because we chose to move through it together. Because we chose grace. Because we chose to believe that the mistake didn't have to be the end of the story. Our story didn't end. It transformed. Your story doesn't have to end either. It can transform too. Fourth, you have to forgive yourself. This is the one most people skip. This is the hard one. You'll confess. You'll cry. You'll do the work. You'll rebuild. But you won't forgive yourself. You'll carry that shame like a backpack filled with bricks for the rest of your life. And God is not asking you to do that. When Jesus restored Peter, he was also saying, "Peter, I forgive you. Now you need to forgive yourself." The person who's hardest on you is you. The person who will never let you forget this is you. The person who will replay this moment 1,000 times and find new ways to hate yourself is you. And until you can sit with yourself and say, "I made a mistake. It was real. It mattered. It hurt people. But it doesn't get to define me anymore. It doesn't get to be the final word on who I am." You're not free. You're just in a different prison. For me, that forgiveness came when I was about 3 years into counseling. I was sitting in my office with a patient. I'd started working again, carefully, with supervision, with humility. And he said something about his own failure. He was ashamed. He was convinced he was disqualified. And I realized I was actually okay. I was actually helping people again. Not because I'd forgotten what I'd done, but because I'd stopped believing that it had to be the end of my story. That's when I knew I'd forgiven myself. And here's what I want you to know, sitting here, looking at you. If you're sitting there right now, and you feel like you're done, like you've crossed a line you can't uncross, like God is disappointed in you, or done with you, or ashamed of you, you're wrong. You're listening to a voice that isn't God's voice. God's voice is the one that says, "I see you. I know what you did. And I'm still here. I'm still calling you forward. You don't get to sit in this shame forever. You don't get to be finished. I'm not finished with you. The mistake you made is real. The consequences are real. The pain is real. But the end of your story is not determined by one moment. It's determined by what you do next. It's determined by whether you have the courage to confess, to face it, to rebuild, and to forgive yourself. So let me check off what we started with. Check off the opening. You were drowning in shame. Check off the lie that you're disqualified. Check off the isolation. Check off the voice that said it was over. Because those things don't get to own you anymore. They're not the truth. They're not the final word. What does own you now is a choice to move toward grace instead of away from it. A choice to understand that your failure is your qualification to help others. A choice to believe that God's story for you isn't over. A choice to forgive yourself. A choice to start again. So, give it a like if this resonated with you. Subscribe to the channel because we're back every week with stories like this. And in the comments, tell me, what was the moment when you fell and needed to get back up? What was the time you thought it was the end and it wasn't? I read every comment. Subscribe, leave a like, and I'll see you in the next video.